Okay.
Yes, it is time.
Okay. I'm back.
All right. Hi.
Hello.
Hey.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Churches Uniting in Christ series, Tired and Torn. Today we will be addressing race, health, but from the perspective of self-care. My name is Reverend Amina McIntyre. I'm the young adult one of the young adult representatives from the the Churches United in Christ, and we have with us also Bishop Jefferson Storton, who also serves as the president of Churches United in Christ, and I will give a little bit more information about her in just a moment, as well as Dr. Emmanuel Larte, who is a world-renowned, internationally known pastoral care professor at Emory University. So hello, everyone. Hi, panelists.
Hello.
Hello.
Awesome. And so I just want to make sure first things first, there are two different ways you can view us attendees. You can either from your own screen view us in the speaker view, which will switch people back and forth, or you can click gallery view and you'll be able to see all of us at the same time at all times. My preferred viewing way gallery view is at the top right, and it just kind of makes it so that you don't have to worry about the screen switching back and forth, and so that you're able to stay fully attentive to the process. I also ask that everyone, when we can see you or hear you or not, to turn off your cell phones, or at least put them on silence or mute, so that we don't get any dings and buzzes. We are recording today. And very lastly, if you are an attendee and you would like to ask a question, if you would simply click in your chat box, there is a chat box available so that you're able to type your question, and our admin for the day will take a look at that question, and when it is time for us to do question and answers, then we will make sure that those questions are filtered through to our panelists. So without any further ado, welcome to the event this evening. So first I want to tell you all a little bit about Churches Uniting in Christ. It is an ecumenical organization that brings together 10 main American denominations. I think we might have a few more now, actually. And its predecessor was the Consultation on Church Union. So it's been doing work for over 40 years for sure, really working on reconciliation, and particularly across racial lines, but also just within the church, to see how the church can grow and be more of a unit among each other. It is cross-denominational lines, and so there are many different denominations that are part of Churches Uniting in Christ, and we tend to meet about once a year, typically to have a major public event, and to be involved with the church to talk about some of the concerns of our individual denominations. The Young Adult Task Force of Churches Uniting in Christ wanted to probe deeper into some of the more recent issues that are going on across the denomination, particularly as it relates to race and mental health. And so we have this 4-part web series. So today is the first one, and we also have 3 other of the panels coming up really shortly. We have one next week. We have October 12th. We have another one in about 2 weeks, and we have one November 5th. But all that information will be given to you before the end of the workshop today. So without any further ado, let me go ahead and introduce to you all the panelists for today. First, Bishop Jefferson Storton. Teresa Jefferson Storton is the 59th bishop and the first female bishop of the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. She is the presiding bishop of the 5th Episcopal District, which includes Alabama and Florida. She is the ecumenical bishop, and so she sits on very many boards, including Churches Uniting in Christ, as well as Pan Methodist Council. She has taught Encounter School Theology. She's taught in a variety of different places. She has an empowerment conference called the Phenomenal Women's Summit, and she also is she's the former president of the Association of Professional Chaplains. I'm sorry, she's a former executive director, of the Association of Clinical Pastoral Education, and she is a chaplain and a board certified chaplain. And she is a native of Kentucky. She's married to Reverend Lawrence Jefferson Snorton, the mother of 2 adult sons and 2 grandchildren. So if you all would welcome Bishop Jefferson Snorton. I'm sure you all are applauding, even if we can't all completely hear your applause here. And also, next week, the next panelist is Dr. Reverend Dr. Emmanuel Arte, who teaches pastoral theology, care counseling at Campbell School of Theology, as well as in the Person, Community, and Religious Life program at Emory University's the Graduate Division of Religion. He has previously taught the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom and Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. He particularly examines pastoral and spiritual care theories and practices operating in African and European and American cultures. He is one of the pioneers in developing intercultural approaches to pastoral care and counseling, and he has a book, In Living Color, an Intergenerational Approach to Pastoral Care and Counseling, which is now in its 2nd edition and can be purchased in Amazon and all bookstores near you. So thank you all both for attending this particular panel. So without any further ado, I want us to go ahead and kind of dive right into the topic of the evening. We were talking about the Young Adult Task Force. We have been talking about what's going on, especially in the news, and how we can really, as church members, really think of how we can respond to all the different things that are occurring and happening in the world at large, and how we can be more of a community. And one of the things that we talked about was the issue of, as it talks about race and a lot of the things that are happening in the world, especially with a lot of the riots and not the riots, but the protests that have been happening, a lot of, especially with the movements of Black Lives Matter, and even more recently, and while this isn't necessarily racial, the impact of seeing things like what has happened in Las Vegas thrown across the media, and what is now inciting, because now people are really going toward gun control. At the end of the day, we can get very tired of watching images and taking it all in and wondering what it is that we can do. And so we wanted to have a conversation with you all about just in terms of from a pastoral care perspective, how can we approach different, specifically as we're seeing traumas on a regular basis and it's all around us, and we feel the need to approach everything and to become activists and to really do something about it, how we can further ground ourselves and how we can move forward in the process. And so I'd like to, the first question I'd like to give you both is, given the most recent events of protest and Black Lives Matter and historical legacy in this country, what is the impact of the visuals that we're seeing constantly on our participation, and how does it affect our overall mental and spiritual health?
Well, I guess I'll go first. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have been keenly aware the last several days of how exhausting all of this news and all of this trauma is. To be honest, I'd say at some points it just feels completely overwhelming. Almost daily we're greeted with news of another disaster, another tragedy, senseless violence, unjust verdicts, and all other kinds of things that I would describe as social madness. The 24-hour news cycle, the constant news feed of Twitter and Facebook keep these things in our view. And I think that if you don't have a good sense of spiritual discipline, it really could lead you to feel both hopeless and helpless. When the other day when I was trying to move myself out
Bishop Snorton, Dr. Larte, are you all able to respond?
Yes.
Did you not hear me?
Okay, I could hear you, but I don't know if Amina could.
Reverend McIntyre.
You can continue.
Okay.
I'm having some tech difficulties on my side, but go ahead and please continue.
Okay.
Well, as I was saying, it could make you feel hopeless and helpless. The other day when I was trying to move myself to a different space in relation to all this tragedy and bad news and just all kinds of injustice and just things that make us almost disgusted with our own community and society. I read Habakkuk in the Bible, that first chapter, the second verse says, "How long, O Lord? How long will I cry for help and you will not hear? I will cry out to you violence, yet you do not save." That was Habakkuk's kind of, that really captured for me my sense of, I guess, almost despair. But then I was moved to remember, and I even typed this in the newsletter I did last week, that we should not grow weary in well-doing. And so if the call is for us to stay strong and stay committed, then we have to really exercise the discipline of moving ourselves out of those places of despair and hopelessness. And to a great extent, I don't think there's any magic to it, but you do have to be aware, and especially aware of when you individually are feeling the press of all the news, so that you can self-supervise and self-intervene. Dr. Marte?
Yes, I would. Yes, thank you. I completely agree with what Bishop Snowden has just been saying. It feels very much like the floods that we have experienced through after the hurricanes and all of that. But the flooding seems to come mentally, spiritually, physically, socially, all the dimensions of our lives seem flooded by an overload of traumatic or tragic or soul-destroying things. So I found myself in the last few months finding it really difficult to switch on the radio or click on the television simply because it was almost like as if I was at my threshold, my limit. So, the constant barrage of information, news, depictions, pictures, and so on, all of which seems to kind of press so hard upon us, is the reality of the day. And so feeling overwhelmed, feeling fatigued, feeling really under siege is very much the situation that many of us, many people find themselves in. And so I think that this conversation is really timely, especially as we begin to think about strategies of taking care of ourselves and dealing with the floods that come at us on all levels of our being.
Dr. Larte, I think
thank you both for responding. And as we're talking about this conversation, I just realized that some people might have different perspectives of what mental health and what spiritual health are. And can each of either one of you elaborate or kind of give a definition of what you all are meaning when we're talking about this particular conversation?
Well, I think mental, there are a variety of definitions. The one that I think might be relevant, or a way of thinking about mental health and spiritual health that might be relevant to tonight's conversation, is that state of being where you feel able to cope with the changing life around you. And when you find that you don't have the resources you need, you have the energy and the insight to go and find those resources.
Right.
Right. So that's kind of a definition that I think is helpful more than the scientific ones. Is
right.
When I know that stuff is happening, but I can figure it out. I can work my way through it. When you're healthy, that's usually your posture. When you're unhealthy, when you're spiritually depleted,
right.
when you have compromises to your mental health, everything becomes a major challenge or major hurdle. It's often difficult to have the energy or the wherewithal to even mobilize yourself to cope with it.
And I would add to that the ability to balance. In other words, the ability to hold various things together, hold them in tension. So if it's spiritual health, then it's to do with being able to hold together and balance various kinds of things that may be going on in terms of one's spiritual life, in terms of one prayer, meditation, and other spiritual disciplines that we engage in. If it's in terms of our emotional and psychological life, then we're able to handle different kinds of experiences and hold them all together. Health, to me, is this ability to balance and to hold things on the various levels, to hold them together, and then very much to cope with any changes, like Bishop Norton is saying.
And my question becomes then, with that particular definition, over the past 2 years, there's been discussion about a concept that's actually not very new, but it's called compassion fatigue, specifically as it's relating to people directly involved with activism work or just involved with being within a particular group that is impacted by different events. Especially those who are witnessing tragedies. Can you talk a little bit about compassion fatigue and possibly any ideas that you all might have about how to look at ways in which of identifying it as well as combating compassion fatigue?
Well, let me talk about compassion fatigue, and then I'll leave combating compassion fatigue to Dr. Larte. Well, I found it interesting that the term was actually first used in the early 1800s when there were so many immigrants coming that people were losing their sensitivity and compassion and their just general interest in caring about immigrants. So they were tired of being compassionate. Since the 1950s, the term has been embraced to generally refer to professionals or other individuals who spend a lot of time in caregiving, working directly with people who have been victimized or subject to some kind of trauma, and just that repeated exposure to those who have such acute needs leads to the possibility that the caregiver, the pastor, the minister, the nurse could have compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is also known as secondary traumatic stress or vicarious or secondary traumatization. In other words, there just seems to be some reality that when you engage and get close to and get entwined into the experience of someone who's been traumatized, you yourself begin to experience or re-experience, or at least empathically envision the impact of that trauma. So compassion fatigue is real. And I think particularly when it comes to people of faith, that's important for us to remember, because so often we think that we ought to just keep on going in spite of. And that can be a very dangerous posture to take if you don't recognize when you're actually depleted, when you're feeling empty, when you really don't have anything to offer. You're not going to be a good caregiver, a good counselor, a good minister. You're not even going to be a good activist if all of your inner resources have been depleted. So compassion fatigue is something to be mindful of. And there's no magic pill. There's no medical intervention, but I'm sure that Dr. Larte knows some skills and strategies that we all can employ when we feel ourselves subjected to or moving towards compassion fatigue.
So I think of it in terms of the realization that we are limited. We are human. That means that there is a limit to our abilities, our capacities to do everything, so we are limited on all the different levels of our existence. We are limited physically. We can't be in 5 different places at the same time. We are limited mentally. There are certain things that are beyond our abilities. And compassion fatigue sets in when we bump up to that limit, that point of limit, right? And when our container is depleted, it's whatever it is that is in that container has run out. So it's like a car that has run out of gas. I mean, there's a limit to the tank, and the gas is gone. So then that car is not going to be able to function. That's the kind of image that I have in my mind when I think of compassion fatigue. We bumped up against the limit. Our container is empty. And so we need refilling. We need so all the strategies that I would think about and talk about are strategies to replenish, strategies to refill. And we'll probably talk about this some more later. But when one comes to the limit, you have to allow for the container to return to its shape and place. So resting is one of the best ways of dealing with this. Let it rest, and then strategies to refill, to replenish that which has been depleted.
And so what it sounds as if the biggest part of even in all of these ideas of compassion fatigue and what's going on, part of it is also people having being able to recognize that, hey, this is going on within myself, and also being careful of not telling, I guess, being able to share with others that this is what's going on with you, but not necessarily saying, okay, diagnosing them, well, you have this in particular. So, and I guess the question I want to ask here is, in the sense that, you have to be very reflective and very aware of yourself. What if there are people who are not aware of where they are and are not really understanding what's happening with them? What are some ways that that we can kind of talk with people and educate people about it, and also just kind of assist people in this particular process, so that they can actually be effective community leaders as we go on? I'm going to ask a little bit more about community leadership in just a second as well.
Well, I think you hit on it when you say leadership. I think it's incumbent upon leadership, people in positions of leadership, first to possess those tools of self-awareness, but also part of being a leader is structuring the work so that it includes time for self-care, so that self-care is kind of integrated into the fabric of what we're doing, looking at the breadth and scope of the work, and then trying to figure out, now, how do we not overwhelm people? How do we give them a chance to be a part of and step away? I think if you build that in as a leader, you're going to naturally begin to help those people who may not have the skill to recognize their own limitations, their own compassion fatigue, people who may be overzealous about the work, or just not have good boundaries, or sometimes just be so committed to the cause that it blocks out their vision of everything else, of the other realities of life. So I think it's incumbent upon leadership. Whoever's in charge ought to make sure that they are modeling good self-care, and ought to build into whatever work is being done self-care, time for self-care, embrace it, affirm it, incorporate it, so that it becomes the norm rather than the exception. I think what we see often in the church is we work people so hard, and then we don't realize how hard we worked them until they all quit showing up.
Right. And so that kind of, that recognition, I think, is It's both on the part of workers ourselves and on the part of leadership. You know, sometimes one of the things that happens is we do not recognize when we are at our limit. When you hit your limit, tiredness is one of the clues. Fatigue is one of the things, but also this inability to make careful or wise choices is another thing that is a symptom of this. A person who is experiencing fatigue is often going to find themselves making bizarre choices, making choices that don't actually serve so whenever I find that I'm beginning to not be able to explore, not be able to reflect, not be able to I feel kind of like I feel I'm stuck in any kind of way. That often to me is a symptom of fatigue. And so I need to recognize this. And then the people for whom I'm working, or the people who lead me, also need to be able to not work me to the point of this, but really recognize that, okay, I'm beginning already to see that there's just you're dealing with a lot. And so let me allow space and time for care before I continue to put on you more and more. So it's very, very important to recognize, and it's very, very important to plan into our work schedules those times of self-care, those times of reflection that will enable us to replenish ourselves and be alive and be able to make sensible choices.
Reverend McIntyre, may I just give, I think, what is a real concrete example that some people, particularly those who've done clinical pastoral education or CPE, might understand. At most CPE centers where I've worked, one individual will stay overnight and spend the night at the hospital answering all of the emergency calls. And if you're in a real active hospital, you're probably going to experience some deaths, some trauma, car accidents, maybe even gunshots. It can be a fairly intense overnight experience. We would always begin the next morning when the chaplains who had been at home asleep would sit with the chaplain who had been up all night to give that chaplain the opportunity to debrief, to describe what happened, to kind of vent and reflect on what that experience had been like before they just went off home. And I think that that's a way in which we provide, or we can provide, assistance to one another and incorporate some self-care moments. While that might sound like, or might feel like it's a functional thing, it actually serves the purpose of reconnecting the individual chaplain who's been by himself to the community of chaplains, so that he or she doesn't carry all that stuff that they experienced overnight by themselves. And then we would, send the chaplain home, go home, get some sleep. As a supervisor, I made sure if we were going to expect anything out of that chaplain the next day, and I usually tried to avoid it. I tried to avoid having a group right after that because the chaplain's tired. So in community, in the church, if we're having some sort of activist action, you ought to have time to debrief so people can talk about what they experienced and take their individual experiences and put them back in the collective pool of emotional support of everybody else who was a part of the experience. And it doesn't have to be a horrible thing that you're doing or a response to a terrible thing that's happened. Even if you're just going out and doing evangelism and knocking on doors, telling people about your church, or having vacation Bible school for your neighborhood, there ought to be a time where you come together and debrief and reflect and talk about what made you comfortable and where you were uncomfortable, what you felt you did well. That incorporating those kinds of experiences can really begin to teach people how to reflect, and how to be self-aware.
I think that's a really very go ahead. Okay, I was just going to say that I think that sense of incorporating into the schedule designated times for debriefing, resting. I mean, it's almost like as if rest is not something that needs to be programmed into or scheduled. We seem to assume that, you ought to be ready to go. We don't realize that you actually have to schedule rest. I mean, God did in creation. God actually scheduled a whole day of rest, so we have to schedule into our program. This is rest time, and it's not that time is not wasted time. It's not time that is not productive. It's actually crucial to any plan, whether it's a plan for activist activity. Needs to include rest, needs to include reflection, needs to include debriefing, needs to include all of these kinds of things that appear like as if they are retreating, but actually are crucial to any kind of ongoing, impactful ministry and work.
Let me give one last example. I once worked on a church staff, and every 7th week, there were no meetings allowed at the church.
Right.
Every 7th week. And when people, during that 7th week, there was a meditation guide so that people would spend time in their homes with their families. And there was a meditation for every day, some prayers, things that they were supposed to be doing. I felt like that was a really good model of how you intentionally stop and refresh yourself, refuel yourself. So there are all kinds of ways in which we can make sure that whatever work we're planning takes the need to care for the caregiver or the activist or whoever to replenish and refuel.
And so now it sounds like to me that, and I'm glad that you all brought up this idea of debriefing and reflecting, and I'm starting to learn the value of debriefing myself. But what I'm wondering is, because it's like within itself, especially when people are starting to do activism, or even if they're intentionally doing evangelism work or intentionally doing community work, there's also, there are several interruptions that happen. And so in our own busyness and the things that we're doing, like as we are going about the work and busy, making ourselves more and more busy doing the work that we are doing, that we have to be willing and flexible enough to allow these interruptions to occur. Because I'm feeling like, and correct me if I'm wrong, and you all can press a little further into this, that maybe one of the things that we're starting to kind of get out of tune with is the time and space where we need to, and maybe even getting out of the sensitivity of the fact that interruptions do need to occur, and it is okay for interruptions to occur. And maybe by building into the schedule the time for an interruption, if an interruption happens, then it's not something that's seen as a foreign object or something that we resist to. Because I think even that one of the biggest things, because, just talking from a young adult perspective, I think sometimes young adults feel like their voice isn't heard. And I'm wondering if it's, and especially even talking about other ministers and other places, that part of the conversation really has to become that if we have to allow the interruptions for everyone to occur, because as we keep moving forward, then everyone needs the space and the opportunity to reflect, to interrupt, and as well as to kind of debrief in order to move forward in whatever part their ministry is impacting on them.
Mm-hmm. I will reflect on my own experience, recent experience. Hurricane Harvey, and those images were just absolutely horrific. Mm-hmm. And that was followed by Hurricane Irma, which went through a part of the country that I'm responsible for, which is the state of Florida. And, I found myself, kind of listening to some of the rhetoric about why particular areas were being hit and why not and all that. And I was in my own meditation one day, it occurred to me that if we have a takeaway from all this stuff that's happening around us, it's the reality that we are not in control. And I think when we try to be in control of all our time, scheduling everything, we quickly realize something is going to happen that we did not plan for. It may not be as drastic as a hurricane. It might just be a flat tire. It might be, a sudden sore throat, or it might be as you're going out of the house, you hear water running and you realize your water tank just busted. And so that's why whatever work we're doing, we don't need to program ourselves so tightly that we don't have time to experience life as it unfolds. And that brings me to the point that I think is absolutely crucial, is that we don't work in isolation, that we have others that are part of the work, so that if my tire goes flat, there's somebody else that knows what's supposed to happen until I get there. All too often, I think leaders are guilty of this. We want to be the only one. We want to be the one that everybody depends on and relies on, or we have a hard time delegating, or we don't see anybody else having the skills. But because life happens, we have to understand activist work, ministry work, it's a shared work. It's not a work that we can hoard or keep to ourselves. And I think when we construct our work in that way, when life happens to one of the people participating in the event, we all step in that void. And that may even mean some people go to the hospital with a friend while the rest of us stay and continue the work. We lose our sense of humanity, our humanness, and even our sense of empathy and compassion for one another when the schedule takes precedent over people.
It's so true that and so true that sometimes it takes interruptions to actually bring us to the realization that we are over functioning and over scheduled, and so on. Sometimes it's that, and I'm thinking just this afternoon we had a fire in our building in Kansas School of Theology.
Oh my.
And so we all had to vacate the building and stand outside while the fire folk came in and so on. So from round about just before 3 until well over 4, we were standing outside, and classes were disrupted. In fact, classes have had to be cancelled for this afternoon at Candler. But in the moments when we were standing outside, we began to talk to each other and began to reflect on various things and so on. Students, faculty, staff, and I think that there was a certain degree of relief that came to us, and it took the interruption to actually bring that. So sometimes interruptions happen that way, but I think it's also absolutely important to be flexible in the way in which we organize and plan and schedule things, to have a certain degree of flexibility and ability to change, so that things that come, because sometimes interruptions are really an opportunity to engage in some of the things that are really crucial in life.
And so given that, I mean, because I'm glad that you all are all right at Candler, that the fire didn't, that everyone was fine, even in the interruption. and we'll keep you all in prayer as you all rework and assess the damage that took place at the seminary today. And we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I want to ask one more quick question of you all. And if there's anyone who are attendees who have any questions they would like to ask, go ahead and start chatting in the box so that we can see them and we can ask the panelists those particular questions. But in this conversation about self-care and debriefing and these interruptions, and even this idea of planning for it, how do we start to create are there resources for liturgies and rituals and ceremonies, or even just ideas of care that we can start to implement, and that you can suggest and give as resources? And also, the second part of that question is, how then do we, if we are knowledgeable of what's happening and the need for the interruption and need for the space, begin to start approaching, even though a lot of us are church leaders ourselves, how do we begin to approach church leaders and community leaders and other activists and people who are around us to encourage people to make sure that this, once we have kind of identified different rituals and ways that can assist, how can we help them to start understanding that this is an important something to have, and that is not just important, but absolutely necessary to have the space to implement these self-care practices, and for our own well-being and for our own preservation of self.
Well, I think the first thing we have to recognize is all martyrdom isn't good or healthy.
Right.
Everyone, I think, likes to think of themselves as having some noble quality, and activist work and pastoral work are key arenas where that often gets played out. And I think what we have to really stay attuned to and in touch with is, why are we doing what we're doing? If we're doing it for recognition or affirmation or for money or for some other kinds of reward other than the principle that's involved behind the work, the faith principle, the social justice principle, whatever it is, then we are setting ourselves up just to burn out.
Right.
Because as soon as the reward does not happen, then we begin to feel like, what's the point? But principled work always remains embedded in the principle. So if I'm going to be an advocate, say, for children, then I will understand, if that's the principle, I will understand that when I'm angry and upset, I'm not a good advocate nor a good model. So I think calling ourselves as individuals and even as communities, and rituals help us do this, help remind us of why we're doing what we're doing, helps us to stay grounded in the principle. I think these kinds of concepts are really important when we see leadership struggles or turf battles over who's going to do what or who's going to get the credit. At the end of the day, we have to realize that that's totally irrelevant if the principle is to make sure that people are not being oppressed, that folks who are in bondage are liberated. We have to constantly remind ourselves, why are we doing what we're doing? And so if I decide that I want to be a martyr, I need to be a martyr for the principle and not a martyr so that I get more brownie points than somebody else, or so that I get my name in the paper, or that I get that photo op. And all of those things are very difficult, which is why I think community is so important for activist work. If you're going to do any kind of activist work, if you're going to be an advocate, if you're going to be a part of any kind of social justice movement, or even if we just even if we're just talking about being part of the pastoral care team, teaching Sunday school, doing Christian education, doing evangelists, it really doesn't matter. Maintaining that sense of connection to the body is critical and important. And then the body itself helps the body. My foot starts hurting, and when my foot starts hurting, it reminds the rest of my body that although I want to keep going, I can't. And so when we're connected to the
Right.
body itself helps do the self-correcting and the self-monitoring that oftentimes we can't do when we're isolated or trying to function in a vacuum or be that lone ranger.
I really want to add to this sense of community accountability and really how we need to be our sister and our brother's keeper in this sense. We, rather than laying on more and more expectations and more kind of uh, duties and responsibilities on each other, which clearly holding us, when we think of accountability, is often more crucial activities of accountability for community need to be holding us accountable for our care of ourselves, so that I need people to help me to take care of me. I may be going, and sometimes not even recognizing that I'm really stressed. I need somebody beside me or around me, others around me, who will help me to recognize that go home, Emmanuel, go home, go and rest. You need to sleep. You need to, sometimes that is missing. And then the other thing that I want to also say is that the different aspects of our lives, we are spiritual, emotional, physical, mental, and social beings. I want to say that when we speak, we often speak about a wellness wheel, which has all of these aspects. Well, so also care has to happen in each of these arenas of our lives. So I need to be able to take a mental Sabbath. I need to be able to take a physical Sabbath. I need to take an emotional Sabbath. I need to take a social Sabbath. I need to plan so that my mental Sabbath, for me, mental Sabbath is when I read novels and stories and things that are not what I spend my time normally doing. So rest for my mental life comes in that kind of way. I take a social Sabbath. I take situations where I don't want nobody to be near me. I want to be on my own, and I want to just have a break from all those social responsibilities that I engage in. I take a spiritual Sabbath when I don't read the Bible. I don't do any of those disciplines that I do. I simply give my spirit a time to replenish and to restore. So I want to emphasize the fact that our
Did Dr. Larte speak? Reverend McIntyre.
And we have two questions here. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Larte. Before I go into the questions, because I think it's even some people feel as if you can't possibly be tired of praying and reading and being involved with the spiritual space, but even that's important too, is knowing that when you rest, you have to rest sometimes have to rest from everything, and that's important to work with. And so as we finish up, I'm going to go ahead and open up the conversation for some questions. And I see that Dr. Larte is going to have to probably re-log back in. But I'm going to go ahead with the question with you, Bishops Jefferson Snorton, as we're going on. One of the questions from the audience is, can you talk about particular self-care practices you have found helpful in your own work or working with faith leaders? And just can you just talk about any particular self-care practices that you know might work for persons to be able to implement themselves?
Well, I can only tell you some of the things that have worked for me. What really helped me break the cycle of not doing good self-care was to schedule self-care, to actually put on my calendar time for self-care. At the time, it sounded to me like a silly thing to do. Like, I'm going to sit down and be quiet for this hour and not answer the phone. But it actually worked. It helped me to break a really unhealthy cycle. As I've continued to try to do good self-care, I really do try to maintain awake hours and sleep hours, go to bed at a certain time, get up at a certain time, pay attention to what I'm eating, keep all my doctor's appointments, and make sure that I'm attuned to my physical well-being. I designate certain time of the week as my day off. I think for people in ministry in particular, so important because the work never stops. And this is where the rubber hits the road, because often you are your own worst enemy. I will say this is my day off, and then I'll spend the day on my computer, or I'll spend the day answering the phone, taking calls. So you have to be highly attentive to your own discipline and the need to maintain whatever you say you're going to do. Finding something that you enjoy that is not work related, really important. Reading, going to the movies, going on walks, spending time with nature, cycling, taking pictures, bird watching, doesn't matter what it is, but just doing something just for the joy of it. Really, I think is an important spiritual discipline. Having a great support system. A good support system is important, but a great one is even better. People that you know you can count on when you're in a pinch, because as we said, those interruptions will happen, and you need to have your go-to girl or guy that you know can help you so that you don't feel torn into so many different pieces and places. And then learning how to set boundaries of your own and respect boundaries. As bishop, this was one of the biggest things that I had to come to grips with. Everybody has something that they want the bishop to hear about or help them do. And I finally had to get to the point where I had to realize I can't take on everybody's cause and everybody's interest. I had to create some boundaries. Here's what I evaluate as the needs in my area. Here are the things that I think are important. Here are the skills that I think I have, and that's all I can do. So learning how to say no and not feel guilty. Right. To tell someone, right, I'm sorry, that's not my area of expertise. I'm sorry, I don't have time for that. I'm sorry. And part of that is being aware of other resources. It's a great ministry called the Ministry of Referral. I can't do that, but let me refer you to this agency or another person or another resource. That can be, people then feel like you have heard their need and you've taken it seriously, but you don't overextend yourself or overfunction to the point where you are eventually not going to be able to sustain yourself or be effective. So those are just a few of the things that I've done to try to maintain good self-care.
And I will add rest, sleep, and activities like games. I like to watch soccer. So those and as I was saying earlier on, I try to look for activities that give rest to the different aspects. So I look for what is it that I'm spending a lot of my physical energy on. Let me take a break from that. What is it that I'm spending most of my, so I was giving the example of reading a novel rather than reading a textbook, you know, those kinds of things. And then, you know, having a retreat. I like to have silent retreats because I spend a lot of my time talking. So I like to have times when hours when I can just be quiet. And I like to have those occasions when I'm on my own. So I try to look for activities that will give me a break in the emotional arena, in the spiritual arena, in a physical arena, and in a mental, and then in a social arena as well.
And the next question is, how can we differentiate between activism and advocacy so that we are able to better understand boundaries for our own selves in regards to self-care? And this comes from Antonio Reed.
Well, I think a good dictionary might help.
Activism and advocacy. Distinguish between, was it activism and advocacy, you said?
Yes, activism and advocacy. Okay. I was making light of the question in terms of maybe a good dictionary would help, but I do think that when we're advocates, we're basically taking a position, we're taking a stand. I want to advocate for something or advocate against something. And there are times when that kind of voice needs to be heard. But then there also becomes moments where you have to move beyond just taking the position and actually become active in some action, usually to push up against some authority or some entity or some enterprise that's keeping the vision from becoming possible. So we are all, I would think, in the church, for example, we would be advocates for healthcare for everyone. But with all that's been happening lately in our government, I think we're increasingly seeing the need that we may have to become more activist in our approach to the dilemma, not just to say we believe in this thing, but we're actually going to demand it. I think the civil rights movement is a really good example. The church for years and years was an advocate for freedom and justice for all. In the Black church, but it took activists who pushed against and spoke truth to power to actually get change, some change to occur.
Yeah.
And our last question for the evening is, in light of the many recent natural disasters, governmental inadequacies or inaction, and the desire to come to the aid of the hurting poor around the globe, how might persons make a personal, compassionate difference without becoming overwhelmed or experiencing compassionate burnout? And this comes from Dr. Ori Spraggan.
Well, I think as it relates to this topic, tired and torn, mending ourselves so that we can mend the world, the first thing that you I think need to do is be keenly aware of what resources you have to offer. If you have meager resources, it would not make sense for you to put your own well-being in jeopardy trying to help someone else. And so many times in these natural disasters, what I hope they do for us is, while we need to show care and compassion for those, abroad, if you can't go to Puerto Rico, for example, and help rebuild, there's some children and families in your own neighborhood who would be glad to know that someone cares about them and is willing to invest in them. If you don't have $1,000 to give to the Red Cross, but you know you have 10, give that 10 with a glad heart and give it freely. And, so sometimes we think that we can't do anything because the task feels too big.
Right.
But we all can do something. And sometimes it's just a matter of looking around right where we are and thinking of how we can make a difference. Because I really don't believe that any good deed goes unnoticed by God. And if ultimately we're doing things out of being people of faith, then I don't think God is going to say, well, you didn't go over to the Virgin Islands if you were in your own hometown helping those who are in need. These natural disasters and these grand portrayals of trauma and tragedy only remind us of the human condition as it is. There are folks dying in our own communities daily who are grieving because a loved one was shot. You may never have the opportunity to express your condolences to the family of one of the victims in Las Vegas, but there are people in your own neighborhood who are experiencing grief that you could console and show compassion towards. And so I think that it's the micro and the macro. The big events only remind us of how fragile human life is. And hopefully that reminder empowers us to see where we are and what it is that we have the capacity to do.
So it is so important for us to think soberly and to remember our humanity, remember our limitations. The macro can be so overwhelming and yet also compelling. We want to change the world. And when we see those depictions, our hearts can be so drawn that we wish we could do everything. But the reality is we are limited. We cannot do we can't do a whole lot, but we can do something small. So it's important to think soberly so that we do not become overwhelmed by the enormity of the task, but also at our inability to change everything. We can't change one small circumstance. We can help in one small way. We can extend ourselves one small bit. And it's all of the small acts that are being done that together will make a difference. So I think sometimes we overburden ourselves because we take the mandate. Our mandate is to change the whole world. Really, sober judgment will help us to realize that I can only do so much, but that so much is crucial, is vital in the big picture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If we think of our culture and our community as becoming insensitive or desensitized or embracing beliefs that, well, let them help themselves, as we've had some leadership express, then what we need to do individually is reignite the spark. And if I become the spark in my community, someone else is going to catch that. And if that happens all across the globe, then we change the paradigm. We recreate a culture of caring and compassion. I think because in so many ways we've emphasized achievement and accomplishment over care and concern for our neighbors, our immediate neighbors. It has created a culture of laissez-faire. Somebody else will do it. Mm-hmm. But when we maintain that sense of connected compassion where we are, then if that happens enough in these individual little spaces, eventually we can see a shift back to cultures and communities that really do understand how intertwined our lives are.
Hmm.
This comes to the end of our panel for tonight. There are plenty of other things that I know that I could ask about this subject, and I would love to explore more, but our time has come to a close. And so I'd like to thank you both, Bishop Jefferson Storton and Dr. Larte, for joining us today. And we really appreciate your time and your efforts and energy here.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you so much.
And just before we go, are there any last thoughts or any final words that you all would like to give just to the audience in terms of anything self-care wise?
In this, go on, Bishop Snowden.
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's important to realize that self-care isn't selfish.
Right.
Sometimes people get that mixed up and think, well, aren't I being selfish if I'm looking out for myself? I think not doing self-care is much more selfish, because if you try to function as if your presence doesn't matter, your vitality doesn't matter, and you burn yourself out and you get stressed out, then you're basically denying the community what you have to give to the community. So self-care is not selfish. Self-care is a great act of love, love of God who created you, love of self, who God calls to do some work, and love of neighbor who God wants you to serve.
And what I would add to that is the image that we all experience whenever we are on an airplane and we are being given the instructions from the flight attendants. They always say to us, when there's turbulence, oxygen masks will appear from above. Be sure to put your own mask on first before you try to help anybody else. Because if you are not breathing, you're not going to be able to help anybody else. So that image is one that I would want to keep before us. If there's a word that I want to say, you need to have your mask on. You need to have your oxygen. You need to be breathing. If you're not breathing, you're not able to help anybody.
Amen.
Well, thank you. And on that note, we will all allow ourselves to have some breathing space now.
Yeah.
This has been the panel discussion of Tired and Torn Mental Health. Mental health and self-care in the midst of doing racial justice work or justice work in general, with Bishop Teresa Jefferson Storton and Reverend Dr. Emmanuel Larte. And thank you all so much for joining us. If you like this, go back to Eventbrite where you were and sign up for the rest of the series. Next week we will have Tired and Torn Domestic Violence, Mental Health, and Racial Justice, and it'll feature Dr. Stephanie Crumpton of McCormick Theological Seminary and Wesleyan Whites of Home Beneath God's Wings. We are excited about the rest of the series for the rest of the month of October, and we look forward to you all joining us. The replay will be available. If you signed up for it, you will get it in your inbox, and we will also make sure that the link is circulated so that you can watch the replay or share it if you'd like to with others. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks to the Young Adult Task Force of Churches Uniting in Christ for hosting this series.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation.